Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for nearly 2 decades, and he thought he had seen every possible variation of family dynamics, emotional revelations, and touching moments that a game show could produce. But on that cool October afternoon in 2025, a 99-year-old man named Henry Walsh would share something so unexpected, so tender and heartbreaking in its simplicity, that the entire production would pause, the studio would fall into reverent silence, and Steve would find himself witnessing not a shocking confession or a tale of wartime heroism, but something perhaps even more profound, the quiet regret of a good man who had loved imperfectly and who wanted, in his final months, to finally say the words he had never been able to speak. 2 families stood ready to compete, the Morrison family from Tennessee and the Walsh family from Massachusetts. The Walsh family immediately captured everyone's attention because at their center stood Henry Walsh, at 99 years old, quite possibly the oldest contestant ever to appear on Family Feud. He was a tall man even at his advanced age, standing just over 6 feet, though his posture was stooped now, his body betraying the weight of nearly a century of living. He had thick white hair, remarkably alert hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and moved carefully with the aid of a walker, his hands spotted with age but still steady. His family surrounded him with a tenderness that suggested not just love, but awareness that their time with him was precious and limited. 5 generations, including his 3 surviving children, who were all in their 70s, his grandchildren in their 50s and 60s, his great-grandchildren ranging from their 30s to teenagers, and even several great-grandchildren, the youngest a baby of just 6 months being held by her mother. During the pre-interview, Henry had been remarkably articulate and present for someone his age, answering questions with a dry wit that made the producers laugh and showing no signs of confusion or cognitive decline. When asked what it was like to be 99 years old, he had said with a slight smile, "It's like being 25, except everything hurts and everyone you knew is dead." The producers had laughed, but there was something melancholy beneath the humor, a weight that suggested Henry carried more than just the physical burden of age. His children, when asked about their father, spoke about him with obvious love, but also with a kind of careful respect, the way people speak about someone they admire but perhaps don't feel they truly know. His daughter Margaret, the eldest at 76, had said, "Dad has always been a wonderful father, very reliable and responsible, but he's also always been quite reserved. He's not one for big emotional displays or deep personal conversations. He shows his love through actions rather than words." The other children, Thomas and Elizabeth, had nodded in agreement, and the grandchildren had echoed the same sentiment, loving their grandfather but also acknowledging a certain emotional distance, a wall that he had never quite let them past. The Walsh family won their game with solid teamwork, Henry contributing a few answers, though he was clearly slower than the younger contestants, and seemed content to let his family carry most of the load. As they lined up for fast money, Henry's son Thomas gently suggested that perhaps one of the grandchildren should play instead of Henry, concerned that the rapid-fire questions might be too demanding. But Henry shook his head with surprising firmness and said, "I came here to play. Let me play." Something in his tone, a determination that seemed to go beyond just wanting to participate in a game show, made Thomas step back. Henry's great-grandson went first, scoring 178 points, which meant Henry needed only 22 points to win the $20,000. It should have been straightforward, but as Henry slowly made his way to the podium, gripping his walker, Steve noticed that the old man's hands were trembling more than they had been, and that tears were forming in his eyes before a single question had been asked. Steve approached Henry with his characteristic warmth, taking in the old man's emotional state, and said gently, "Mr. Walsh, you doing okay, sir? You need a minute." Henry shook his head but didn't speak, seeming to struggle with something internal. Steve waited patiently, and the studio fell quiet, everyone sensing that something significant was happening. Finally, Henry looked up at Steve and said in a voice that quivered with age and emotion, "Mr. Harvey, I need to tell my children something before we play this game. I'm 99 years old, I'll be 100 in December if I make it that long, and there's something I've never told them, something I should have said every day of their lives but never did, And if I don't say it now, I'll die without having said it, and I can't do that." Steve's expression shifted from casual warmth to deep attentiveness, and he said quietly, "Okay, sir. What do you need to tell them?" Henry turned to face his 3 children, Margaret, Thomas, and Elizabeth, all in their 70s, all looking at their father with confusion and concern. The studio was absolutely silent, everyone waiting for what revelation would come, expecting perhaps another wartime confession or hidden identity or terrible secret. But what Henry said next was something entirely different, something simple yet profound, something that cut to the very heart of what it means to be human and flawed and loving. Henry said, his voice breaking, "I need to tell you that I love you. I need to say those words out loud, I love you, because I never have. Not once in your entire lives have I told any of you that I love you, and that's the biggest failure of my life." The silence that followed was heavy and aching, and Steve Harvey's face showed complete surprise, not at scandal or heroism, but at this admission of emotional absence, this confession of withheld love. Henry's children looked stunned, Margaret's hand going to her mouth, Thomas's eyes filling with tears, and Elizabeth simply standing frozen, processing what their father had just said. Henry continued, tears now flowing freely down his weathered face. "I was born in 1926, and I grew up in a time and in a family where men didn't say those words. My father never told me he loved me, not once. His father never told him, 'It wasn't what men did. You showed love through providing, through being responsible, through doing your duty, but you didn't say the words.' And I carried that pattern forward with you 3, raised you the same way I was raised, took care of you, provided for you, was there for every important moment, but never said the words you needed to hear. I thought actions were enough. I thought if I was a good father, a responsible father, you would know I loved you without me having to say it. But I was wrong. Words matter. Saying I love you matters. And I robbed you of that, robbed you of hearing those words from your father, and I can't get those years back, but I can say it now before I die." Steve Harvey stood motionless, his eyes glistening with tears, and the audience was equally still, many people crying as they watched this 99-year-old man finally say the words he had withheld for nearly 8 decades. Henry looked at each of his children in turn and said, "Margaret, you were my first child, and from the moment you were born I loved you with an intensity that terrified me. I held you when you were just minutes old, and I promised myself I would be the best father I could be. And I tried. I really tried. But I never told you I loved you. Not when you graduated high school, not when you got married, not when your mother died and we held each other and cried, not when you had your own children and made me a grandfather. Never. And I'm so sorry for that." Margaret was sobbing now, and she said, "Dad, I always knew you loved me. You showed it in everything you did." But Henry shook his head and said, "Maybe you knew, but knowing isn't the same as hearing. You deserved to hear it, and I failed you by staying silent." He turned to his son Thomas and said, "Thomas, you're my only son, and I put so much pressure on you to be strong, to be tough, to be a man in the way I understood manhood. I taught you how to throw a baseball, how to change a tire, how to provide for a family. But I never taught you that it was okay to be vulnerable, to express emotion, to say, 'I love you.' I never told you I loved you because thought it would make you soft, thought it would weaken you, and that was wrong. You grew up thinking your father was proud of you, but maybe he didn't love you, and that's on me. I loved you every single day, was proud of you every single day, and I should have said it every single day." Thomas couldn't speak, just stood there with tears running down his face, nodding slightly, and Henry continued, "And Elizabeth, my baby girl, even when you were 40 or 50 or 60, you were still my baby girl, and I loved you with a father's special tenderness for a daughter. But I never said it. When you came to me crying about your divorce, I held you and told you everything would be okay, but I didn't say, 'I love you.' When you got sick with cancer 10 years ago, and we sat together in hospital waiting rooms, I held your hand, but I didn't say I love you. I was there, always there, but I was silent about the most important thing, and I'm so deeply sorry for that." Steve Harvey finally found his voice and said, his words thick with emotion, "Mr. Walsh, why are you telling them this now? What made you decide to finally say these words?" Henry looked at Steve and said, "Because I'm dying, Mr. Harvey. I don't mean I'm dying right this second, but I'm 99 years old and every day could be my last. And a few months ago, I was sitting in my room looking at pictures of my wife Mary, who died 12 years ago, and I realized that I never told her I loved her either. Not on our wedding day, not when our children were born, not in 57 years of marriage. I showed her in 1,000 ways. I was faithful and devoted and cared for her when she got sick, but I never said the words. And she died without ever hearing me say, 'I love you,' and that breaks my heart. When I realized that, I knew I couldn't let the same thing happen with my children. I couldn't die without telling them what I should have been saying their whole lives." The studio was absolutely silent except for the sound of crying. Audience members and crew members equally moved by this simple yet devastating confession. Henry continued, "I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me or to excuse my failure. I'm telling you because I want my children to know, finally and explicitly, that I love them. I love Margaret, I love Thomas, I love Elizabeth. I love my grandchildren, all 12 of them. I love my great-grandchildren, all 23 of them. And I love my great-great-grandchildren, all 6 of them, even though some of them don't know me, because I'm just the old man who sits in the corner at family gatherings. I love all of you, and I should have been saying it all along, and I'm sorry I didn't." He paused, his breath coming in shaky gasps, and said, "I'm also telling this story publicly because I know I'm not the only father who struggles with this. I know there are men in this audience, men watching at home, who were raised the same way I was, who never heard 'I love you' from their fathers, and who haven't said it to their own children. And I want those men to understand what I've learned too late, that silence is not strength, that withholding those words is not protecting anyone, and that your children need to hear you say you love them no matter how old they are or how obvious you think it should be." Margaret stepped forward and embraced her father, carefully because of his frailty, and she said through her tears, "Dad, I love you too. I've always loved you, and I've always known you love me even if you didn't say it. But hearing you say it now, it means everything." Thomas and Elizabeth joined the embrace, and soon Henry was surrounded by his children, all of them crying, all of them holding each other in a moment of connection that had been nearly 8 decades in the making. The grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren gathered around as well, creating a multi-generational embrace that spoke to the power of finally expressed love, and Steve Harvey stood watching with tears streaming down his face, making no attempt to hide his emotion. After several minutes, Henry gently extracted himself from his family's embrace and turned back to Steve. He said, "I'm ready to play the game now, if you'll still have me, but whatever happens with the game doesn't matter compared to finally saying what needed to be said." Steve wiped his eyes and said, "Mr. Walsh, I don't think we need to play fast money. Your family has already won something more valuable than $20,000. They've won hearing their father say he loves them. But I'm going to give you the $20,000 anyway, and I'm adding another $30,000 from my own foundation, because what you just did took more courage than most people will ever show. It's harder to admit emotional failure than almost any other kind of failure, and you just did that in front of millions of people, because you wanted to make sure your children finally heard what they needed to hear. That's love in action, sir, and I'm honored to have witnessed it." The audience erupted in applause, and Henry stood there looking overwhelmed, still gripping his walker, still crying, but also looking somehow lighter, as if a burden he had carried for 99 years had finally been set down. The episode that aired was one of the most watched in Family Feud history, though it barely resembled a typical game show. The Fast Money segment was never played, replaced entirely by Henry's confession and the family's emotional response, followed by Steve's reflections on the importance of expressing love and the cost of emotional unavailability. The special included interviews with psychologists discussing the generational patterns of emotional expression, particularly among men, and the long-term impact on children who never hear their parents say, "I love you," even when that love is demonstrated through actions. It featured testimony from family therapists about how many of their clients struggle with this exact issue, parents who love deeply but cannot express it verbally, and adult children who know intellectually they are loved but who carry a wound from never hearing the words. The special also included messages from viewers who had been moved by Henry's story, many of them admitting they had the same problem, that they had never told their children or parents or spouses that they loved them, and that Henry's courage in speaking his truth had inspired them to do the same. The response to Henry's confession was overwhelmingly positive and deeply personal for millions of viewers. The show received tens of thousands of messages from people sharing their own stories, fathers who had never said, "I love you," to their children calling them immediately after watching the episode to finally say the words, adult children calling elderly parents to tell them they love them and to ask if their parents love them, spouses having difficult conversations about emotional expression in their marriages. Many viewers wrote that Henry's story had helped them understand their own fathers or grandfathers better, had given them context for the emotional distance they had experienced, and had prompted them to have conversations they had been avoiding for years. Some wrote about fathers who had died without ever saying, "I love you," expressing grief that there was no longer an opportunity for those words, but also finding some comfort in understanding that the silence hadn't necessarily meant absence of love, but rather inability to express it. Mental health professionals praised Henry's revelation as an important catalyst for discussions about masculinity, emotional expression, and generational trauma. They pointed out that Henry's experience, growing up in a time when emotional expression was seen as weakness, particularly for men, was shared by millions of men of his generation, and that the impact of this cultural norm had rippled through families for decades. They used Henry's story to discuss the importance of teaching boys and men that expressing emotions, including love, is not weakness but strength, and that saying, "I love you," doesn't diminish masculine identity but rather enriches all relationships. Some therapists reported that Henry's episode had become a tool in their practice, something they showed clients who struggled with emotional expression to help them understand the cost of silence and the value of speaking their feelings. Henry lived for 7 more months after his appearance on Family Feud, dying peacefully in his sleep in May 2026, just 6 months after his 100th birthday, which he had lived to see after all. In those final months, something remarkable happened in the Walsh family. Henry, having finally broken through his lifelong barrier to saying, "I love you," began saying it regularly. He said it at the end of every phone call with his children, said it when grandchildren visited, said it to great-grandchildren who climbed on his lap, and even said it to the great-great-grandchildren who were too young to understand, but who he wanted to hear the words nonetheless. The family reported that this change in Henry transformed their relationship with him, that the emotional distance that had characterized their entire lives together melted away in those final months, and that they got to experience a warmth and openness from him that they had never known was possible. Margaret later described this period as finally having the father I always wished for, not because he wasn't a good father before, but because he was finally emotionally available in a way he had never been. Those last 7 months were like a gift, a chance to hear him say he loved me dozens of times, making up in some small way for the 76 years when he never said it. Thomas said that having his father tell him, "I love you," for the first time at age 73 had been one of the most powerful experiences of his life, that it had healed something in him he hadn't even known was wounded, and that it had inspired him to be more emotionally expressive with his own children and grandchildren, breaking the pattern that had been passed down through generations. Elizabeth said that in those final months, she and her father had conversations deeper and more meaningful than any they'd had in her entire life, that his willingness to be vulnerable had given her permission to be vulnerable too, and that she was grateful beyond measure that he had lived long enough after his confession for them to build a new kind of relationship. Henry's funeral was attended by his enormous family, 5 generations saying goodbye to the patriarch who had finally, at age 99, learned to say the words they all needed to hear. The eulogies focused on his transformation in his final months, on his courage in admitting his emotional limitations, and on the gift he had given his family by finally expressing his love openly. Margaret gave the primary eulogy, saying, "My father was a good man his entire life. He was responsible, reliable, hardworking, and devoted to his family, but in his final months he became something more. He became vulnerable, emotionally open, and willing to express the love he had always felt but never spoken. That transformation, at 99 years old, was the most courageous thing I've ever witnessed. He taught us that it's never too late to change, never too late to break destructive patterns, never too late to say the words that need to be said. He taught us that strength isn't silence and that love means nothing if it's never expressed. And he taught us by example that admitting failure, especially emotional failure, and then working to correct it, is the mark of true character. I love my father, and I'm so grateful that in his final months, I got to hear him say he loved me too." Steve Harvey attended Henry's funeral, and he spoke about how Henry's confession had affected him personally, had made him examine his own patterns of emotional expression, and had inspired him to be more verbally affectionate with his own children and grandchildren. He said that Henry's story had been one of the most powerful moments in his entire career, not because it was dramatic or shocking in a conventional sense, but because it was so fundamentally human, so relatable to millions of people who either had never heard, "I love you," from their parents or who had never said it to their children. He established a foundation in Henry's name dedicated to promoting emotional literacy and helping families, particularly fathers and sons, learn to express love more openly and to break generational patterns of emotional unavailability. The Walsh family made Henry's story the centerpiece of their own family culture going forward, using his example as a reminder to express love openly and frequently. At every family gathering, they would go around and have each person say, "I love you," to the others, a practice that initially felt awkward but that eventually became natural and deeply meaningful. Thomas took Henry's message particularly to heart, becoming an advocate for men's emotional health and speaking publicly about his experience growing up without hearing, "I love you," and then finally hearing it at age 73. He worked with men's groups, therapy organizations, and parenting programs to encourage fathers to be more emotionally expressive with their children, using his own story and his father's story as examples of both the harm caused by emotional silence and the healing possible when that silence is broken. In the years following Henry's death, his story continued to resonate, frequently cited in discussions about masculinity, emotional expression, and parent-child relationships. Therapists continued to use the episode in their practice, showing it to clients who struggled to express emotions or who were dealing with the impact of emotionally distant parents. Schools began using Henry's story in social, emotional learning curricula, teaching young people that expressing love and emotion is healthy and important regardless of gender. And countless families had conversations they might never have had, inspired by a 99-year-old man who found the courage on a game show stage to finally say the words he had withheld for nearly a century. The episode also sparked a broader cultural conversation about the unspoken rules many families live by, the things that are felt but never said, the love that exists but goes unexpressed. Many viewers wrote about other things they had never said to family members, not just, "I love you," but also, "I'm proud of you," "I forgive you," "I need you," "Thank you," and "I'm sorry." Henry's story became a catalyst for people to examine their own patterns of communication and to consider what important words they might be withholding, what feelings they might be assuming others already know without needing to hear them spoken. Mental health advocates used Henry's example to promote the idea that emotional expression is a skill that can be learned at any age, that it's never too late to change patterns, and that the vulnerability required to say, "I love you," for the first time at 99 is available to people at any age if they're willing to take the risk. Steve Harvey often reflected on why Henry's story had resonated so deeply with so many people when it wasn't shocking or scandalous in the way that many other Family Feud revelations had been. He concluded that it was because Henry's experience touched something universal, the longing to hear, "I love you," from people we love, the pain of emotional distance in families, and the hope that it's possible to change and to heal even very late in life. He said, that Henry had given people permission to acknowledge that silence hurts, even when the love is real, that actions alone aren't always enough without words, and that it takes tremendous courage to admit you've done something wrong for your entire life and then to try to make it right even when you're nearly 100 years old. In the end, Henry Walsh's story became a testament to the power of simple words, to the courage required for emotional vulnerability, to the importance of breaking harmful generational patterns, and to the profound impact that finally expressing long, withheld love can have on families. It showed that emotional transformation is possible at any age, that it's never too late to say the words that need to be said, and that the most profound regrets are often not about dramatic failures but about quiet absences, about love felt but never spoken, about connection possible but never quite achieved. Henry's legacy was not his longevity, impressive though it was, or his role as patriarch of a large family, but rather his willingness to admit his emotional limitations, to acknowledge the pain his silence had caused, and to spend his final months expressing openly the love he had carried silently for so long. The final recording of Henry, made just weeks before his death, showed him surrounded by family, saying clearly and without hesitation, "I love all of you. I wish I had been saying that my whole life, but I'm saying it now, and I'll keep saying it as long as I have breath. Don't make my mistake. If you love someone, tell them. Tell them today, tell them tomorrow, tell them as often as you can. Life is short even when you live to be 100, and the only words that really matter at the end are I love you. Everything else is just noise. I love you all so much, and I'm grateful I lived long enough to finally learn how to say it." These words, simple and profound, became Henry's lasting gift to his family and to the millions of people who heard his story and were inspired to speak their own long, withheld expressions of love.